lot of times when people talk about Jesus, the claims that he made about himself, the natural tendency will be to point to specific messianic prophecies that Jesus fulfilled, or maybe miracles that he performed. Certain texts, obviously, from a gospel like the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "I and the Father am one." These statements that Jesus makes that are pretty clearly associating him with his Father, giving him that sort of elevated status. But one of the things that's often missed is this tendency that Jesus has, especially in John's Gospel, to reimagine and reinterpret the various cultural symbols of the nation of Israel. When you think of the United States of America, or any country for that matter, what sort of cultural symbols come to mind? I know for me, when I think of the United States of America, I think of things like a bald eagle, or maybe the Star-Spangled Banner, the flag, Statue of Liberty, baseball, all these cultural symbols that when you see them, you immediately think, okay, that represents us. That represents our culture. That represents who we are. Well, every nation is like that. Every nation has those important cultural symbols that mean something for those people. And ancient Israel was no different. Ancient Israel had those same cultural symbols that identified them as a unique people. And you can find these symbols in various places in the Old Testament, like in Isaiah chapter 5, for instance. The image of a vineyard was an important cultural symbol to Israel. It was an important agricultural symbol. It was a very important cultural symbol. It was so important, as a matter of fact, that Israel is compared to God's vineyard in Isaiah chapter 5, that the entire nation is a vineyard that God worries over, that God takes care of, that God tends. And so the image of a vine, the image of a vineyard, very important cultural symbol, as is the symbol of shepherding. Shepherds were an important cultural symbol, and there's always a little bit of debate about exactly how Israel felt about shepherds. Some people will say, they didn't care for shepherds at all, as sort of marginalized or outcast people in the society. I don't tend to favor that strong belief. I think that shepherds were an important cultural symbol in Israel. And this is reflected even in a psalm like the famous Psalm 23, where God himself is portrayed as a good shepherd who cares for us, who takes care of us, protects us. So you have all these important cultural symbols. You have, just to give another example, you have the cultural symbol of the Passover event, the Exodus out of Egypt, where various things happened that the Jews remembered and celebrated on an annual basis. They celebrated the Passover, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, on an annual basis. It was an important cultural symbol to them. They commemorated the wandering in the wilderness during the Feast of Tabernacles, where they would actually live in booths, temporary tabernacles for several days. And so you had that whole event which served to define a nation, and so they would commemorate this and reenact it every year. And so my question is, if you look at the Gospel of John specifically, how does Jesus reshape or reinterpret these various cultural symbols? Well, in your ebook this week, I give you a table with several of these cultural symbols that Jesus redefines. Like, for instance, in John chapter 6, we mentioned the Passover event and the Exodus event and how this was an important cultural event in Israel. Well, one of the things that happened in the Exodus was God provided manna out of heaven to feed and nourish his people while they were in the desert wilderness. And one of the beliefs that developed among the Jews was when the new Messiah would come, when the new Moses would come, one of the things that he'd be able to do would be to basically reenact this miraculous feeding that happened while Moses was leading the nation. And so in John chapter 6, Jesus is able to feed a vast multitude of people by giving them, among other things, giving them bread. And so in John chapter 6, the people respond to that. They look at this happening and they say, and most versions actually capitalize the word prophet here. They say, well, maybe Jesus is the prophet. And what they mean by that is maybe Jesus is the one like Moses, who we have been expecting because of this miracle that Jesus performed by feeding them this bread. And Jesus, in the very next passage, he says, you know, in the past, God provided bread from heaven. Our ancestors ate it, but they eventually died anyway. But now he has provided true bread from heaven. And Jesus identifies himself as that bread of life. He reinterprets that symbol. Another instance in John's Gospel, John chapter 3, when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. And Jesus, you know, the famous text, God so loved the world, he gave his son. But one of the things that Jesus says is he links to this Old Testament story where a group of Israelites were bitten by snakes, and Moses holds up a snake in the wilderness, and as long as they look at the snake, they're healed. And Jesus connects himself back to this event in the Old Testament. There's many other examples of this as well. In John chapter 15, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, I am the true vine. Whoever's connected to me will have life and will flourish. In John chapter 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. Imagine a preacher on a Sunday morning getting up and saying, our text for today is Psalm chapter 23, or not chapter 23, Psalm 23, about how the Lord is our shepherd. And then the concluding comment that the preacher makes on Psalm 23 is, and I am that good shepherd. How shocking would that be? But that's exactly what Jesus does in John chapter 10. In John chapter 7 and in John chapter 4, Jesus links himself with living water. Another important cultural symbol. The Jews believed that, based on texts from Zechariah and other places in the Old Testament, that living water would flow from the temple. It would flow from Mount Zion and water the entire world. And they would actually reenact this belief in one of their religious festivals. The priests would pour out buckets of water in the temple to symbolize this idea or this hope for living water. And Jesus says, I am the living water, or I have come to offer living water. In John chapter 8, Jesus stands up during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is not accidental. During the Feast of Tabernacles, it was common for the Jews to light candles in the city of Jerusalem to symbolize the idea that Israel was the light of the world. And so Jesus in John chapter 8 stands up in the middle of the Feast of Tabernacles. I imagine these lights lit all around him, and Jesus says, I am the light of the world. So he reinterprets that cultural symbol. The two most important cultural symbols of all of them for Israel were the temple and the Torah. Those were far and away the two most important self-identifying symbols for Israel, the temple and the Torah, because they both represented God's presence in the midst of his people. And in John's gospel, Jesus reinterprets both of those cultural symbols in terms of himself. He says, my body is the temple. You destroy it in 3 days, it'll be built again. He identifies his own body as the temple. And he also identifies himself with the Torah. He says, when you reject me, you also reject Moses, because Moses was writing about me. He identifies himself with the Torah. And so here's the point. In John's gospel, from beginning to end, Jesus is reinterpreting all of these symbols, all of these images, all of these traditions. He's reinterpreting them in terms of himself. There's no question as to what Jesus believed about himself. Jesus saw himself as the new Israel, that to have life, to have true life, to have salvation, to have, in John's terms, to have eternal life, was only by being connected with him.